Welcome, intrepid historians. Today we're going to talk about constitutions. Now, constitution is a plan of government. It answers basic questions about how any country's particular government is organized, how leaders are chosen, what those leaders' duties and powers are, what their responsibilities, what their job descriptions are, and it describes how laws are made. Now, different countries do constitutions different ways. Some constitutions are unwritten, meaning nobody's ever written down these rules. It's just so there's no documents you can point to that comprise the Constitution. Everything in the Constitution is just custom, the way people are used to doing things, and precedent, examples set in the past that continue to be followed in the present and presumably future. That's kind of vague, though, to have an unwritten constitution, so some countries have a constitution that is partly written. So there are some documents that that answer some of these questions, but there's also some holes between those documents, and filling in the blanks, again, are custom and precedent. And then it's also possible for a country to have a constitution that is all written. Every one of these questions is fully answered in one or more documents, and there's thus no rule for custom or precedent. We're going to see that the British had a partly written constitution. This is King John being forced to sign the Magna Carta in 1215. That document is part of the British Constitution. There are other written bits of the English Constitution. Here's another bit, the English Bill of Rights, written by our old friend, the philosopher John Locke, in 1689. But the British Constitution is only partly written, right? I mean, you can't figure out the whole thing just by reading the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights and some other smaller bits that we didn't talk about in here. There is a lot of scope in the British Constitution for custom and precedent. For example, the custom of the royal veto, the idea that the king could reject certain acts of parliament, that was just something that a king tried at some point and got away with, and so other kings, strategically and with restraint, also tried that now and then. And we also talked earlier about English common law, a body of law that's based on past court rulings. So it's a growing organic system of law that grows over time. It's the accumulation of custom and precedent. Now, the problem with having unwritten parts of your Constitution, these gray areas, these blanks between the documents, is it can lead to misunderstandings, and misunderstandings can lead to conflict. Like after the Stamp Act, when a mob of colonists in Boston ransacked the governor's mansion, looted it, and burned it. Or here, after the Tea Act, when colonists have tarred and feathered a British tax collector, and they're now pouring piping hot tea down his throat, which he is puking out. We could understand the entire American Revolution as a misunderstanding, a disagreement between Britain and the Patriots over, what the British Constitution means, and their understanding of the written, but especially the unwritten parts of the Constitution. Consequently, the Patriots, as they're setting up the United States, they wanted to have constitutions that were 100% written. By the way, this is an abbreviation that I use for Constitution, because Constitution is a long word to write over and over again in your notes. Anyhow, Patriots believed that having everything down in writing would prevent these misunderstandings, prevent these conflicts. Also, entirely written constitutions were a popular new idea from Enlightenment philosophers. There was a French philosopher named Montesquieu who was a big fan of the British system of government. He's like, the British, they've got it figured out. They have the best system of government. though he rued, he regretted the fact that the British Constitution wasn't all written down. He's like, that's how you would perfect it, is you get it all down in writing. Then people can understand it. Part of Montesquieu's philosophical project was he was trying to put down in writing how he thought the British government should work and how it did work, though he injected a lot of shoulds in there. Anyhow, so when the 13 colonies declare their independence as the new United States, well, as colonies, they had sort of local constitutions, their colonial charters. But colonial charters set up a government in each colony, and that setup was predicated on being part of the British Empire. The charters were issued with permission from the king, and now we're independent, so we need to set up constitutions in each state. Most states during the Revolution wrote new constitutions. And the illustration shows in Massachusetts, some legislators getting together to write the Massachusetts Constitution. They're working in somebody's house because it's wartime, and the British are occupying Boston at the time, so they're on the road. Now, the U.S. had a constitution. A written constitution as well, the new United States, though it was nothing special. The first constitution of the United States was called the Articles of Confederation, which is a very long phrase to write over and over again, so after writing it once, I use this abbreviation. This was something Congress just threw together. I mean, Congress itself was thrown together, right? The Second Continental Congress meets after the Intolerable Acts. What are we going to do? And then the war breaks out at Lexington and Concord. So the Second Continental Congress hadn't planned to function as a government, but suddenly they're functioning as a government. And so the Second Continental Congress morphs into the U.S. Congress. And, they basically just wrote down their ad hoc operating procedures as the Articles of Confederation. And so it's not a brilliant document. It's just recording the status quo, what they were doing, what customs they had established. And at that point, the U.S. government was very basic, very simple. The Congress was the whole U.S. government. There was no executive, there was no president, no king. There was no federal judiciary, so any legal problems that arose, Congress just had to vote on. Because they don't have an executive, because there's no president, there's nobody to make command decisions quickly in times of emergency. And they're setting up this government in the middle of fighting a war against the world's greatest power. If there were a time where you needed someone to be able to make some quick decisions and some good decisions, it was here. But every decision during this war is, going to Congress, going to committee, going to a debate, and it takes time. Every state has just one vote in Congress in the Articles of Confederation. This illustration is showing what it looked like. Each state had their own table, right? Each state could send as many representatives as they wanted, but when it came time to vote, each state had just one vote. Now, on one hand, one vote per state sounds fair, but the states had really different population levels. Like, Georgia had barely 40,000 people, and Virginia had more than 400,000 people. So Virginia has 10 times more people, but the same amount of power in the U.S. government? That didn't feel right. Not to the Virginians, at least. The Georgians thought it was a smoking deal. Making decisions in Congress was hard because a simple majority, 7 out of 13, was not enough to make a major decision. Laws required a 9 out of 13 supermajority, which was hard to get. So this makes it difficult for the Congress to make good decisions in wartime under the Articles of Confederation. And if they wanted to change the Articles of Confederation to improve its defects, like, hey, could we get a president, or could we lower the threshold for passing a law? Well, to change the Articles of Confederation, you needed a unanimous vote. 13 out of 13 states had to agree to the change, which makes it functionally impossible. As you might know, if you've ever tried to order a pizza in a group of people, it's hard to get unanimous decisions. And worst of all, and we talked about this when we were discussing the war, Congress, the U.S. government, under the Articles of Confederation, had no power to tax. Wars are expensive, and the country was in bad shape because the government had a huge cash flow problem. The United States was a prosperous country, but that prosperity wasn't getting to the government in the form of taxes. The government was reduced during wartime to borrowing money, which eventually they're going to have to pay back, obviously, and asking states for donations to fund the war effort, and most states were derelict in their duty. Most states did not make their requested, none of the states made all of their requested donations. Some states made some of them, but for the most part, this is a broke, weak government trying to fight and win a war against a very tough opponent. And yet, they managed to win the war. More despite the Articles of Confederation than because of it, but this slide is about things the U.S. actually managed to achieve under the Articles of Confederation, and winning the war for independence, with a lot of help from France, was one of those. Another thing that we haven't talked about yet is illustrated by this map. Here are the original 13 states, and in the Treaty of Paris of 1783, the British had given us the Ohio country, all this territory between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. And they had to figure out what to do with it. States thought that they should extend into the land, like Georgia imagined itself extending from the coast all the way to the Mississippi River. South Carolina thought it should have a skinny little panhandle going to the Mississippi. North Carolina thought it too should stretch to the mighty river. Come back to Virginia in a second. Connecticut, which ended here, thought it should pick up over here. Massachusetts, which ended here, thought it should pick up over there. Massachusetts also thought it should own this bit, and New York's like, no, wait, that's ours. So there's a conflict here between New York and Massachusetts. And there's a conflict over here because Virginia has this audacious claim. Virginia thinks it should command this whole area. So you've got these overlapping, conflicting claims by the existing 13 states to land out west. And they got to sort this out. And they do. This sorting out is led in Congress by Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. Jefferson and his protege, James Madison, cut a deal. I mean, since they're both from Virginia, the state with the most lavish, audacious claims, they are, best set up to propose a solution to this problem. The solution they propose is called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Now, they have a goal here. In addition to sorting out the conflicting claims to land out west, they want to generate some cash flow for the new U.S. government. U.S. government has no power to tax, but what they do have is all this land Britain just gave us in the Ohio country. So they're thinking, if we can organize that land out west and start selling it, if that land belonged to the U.S. government instead of belonging to all those states that are claiming it, then this would be a source of income for the U.S. government. So that's what the Northwest Ordinance is doing. It's getting all those western states, at least in the north, to give up their claims to land out west, to say that land begins to the federal government, and to set, and this new land is going to be the Northwest Territory. And yeah, more in a minute.